Hi everyone, happy Thursday to you wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks on DME for Peace. Just in case you've forgotten, because it's been a bit of a while, my name is Jack Farrell and I am the DME for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground. Today I am delighted to welcome Radhika Hetti, Research and Curator of the Herstories project, who is going to lead a discussion on memorialization, lessons learned from Sri Lanka. Just a note, if you have a question during Radhika's presentation, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once you reach the Q&A. I am now going to hand over to today's guest. Radhika, you're very welcome to Thursday Talks, and feel free to take it away when you're ready.
Thanks, Jack. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Radhika, as Jack mentioned, and I live in Sri Lanka and I work in Sri Lanka. And I'm going to speak to you a little bit about the Community Memorialization Project, which is a joint project between the Herstories project and Search for Common Ground in Sri Lanka. I'm not going to talk about the Sri Lankan conflict at all. So if you have any questions related to the conflict, you can ask me later. I'm just going to say that Sri Lanka had a 26-year-old conflict, or a conflict for 26 years. It ended in 2009, and since 2009, there has been many attempts to try and work on the rifts between the communities and try and do peace building work. The Herstories project, which was initiated in 2012, attempts to deal with memorialization during that time. In 2015, the government changed in Sri Lanka, and the space was more available and open for transitional justice mechanisms. And at that time, the Herstories project initiated this community memorialization project with Search for Common Ground to try and address the needs of memorialization in Sri Lanka. I'll give you a very brief overview of the Herstories project. So it is an archival project. It is housed in the National Archives after it was collected. So what it is that it's a collection of women's stories. There's 285 stories from 7 provinces in Sri Lanka. And it cuts across ethnicity, it cuts across religion and regions. And it was designed as a way to collect female narratives of war, especially because after the end of the Sri Lankan War, the kind of narrative that was being built was very masculine. It was based on a military victory, so it had a lot to do with how the war was won, but not about how it impacted ordinary people's lives. So the project used many different methodologies that I'll speak about later, but these are the same methodologies that were used in collection of stories when we did the Community Memorialization Project as well. So the Community Memorialization Project began in 2015. It is now in its second stage, so phase 2. It collected 352 individual stories, as well as stories of groups, again, cutting across the north, south, and the east of the country, and across ethnicity. What it has done is that it has created a space for acceptance of multiple narratives, or rather, this is what we were hoping it would do. Both these projects, the Herstories project and the Community Memorialization project, are archived online, so it's available publicly. It is also, as I said, archived at the National Archives in Sri Lanka, so there's a physical repository for these stories within the National Archives. Now, in terms of the methodologies that we use for collecting these stories, they were verbal as well as non-verbal. The project itself had 4 different parts, or rather is based on 4 different outreach opportunities. One is the collection and archiving of these stories. The second is using that stories. For example, going beyond archiving. How do we move beyond archiving? And the third is about engaging other community members and other NGOs in practicing memorialization. And the fourth is to reach out through media. So going back to how we collected these stories, These were the same criteria that I developed for the Herstories project, but we used it here as well, and so in some cases we enhanced them. One of the methodologies in which we collected the stories was through video archiving. Unfortunately, I can't show you a video right now, but if you go to the website, there are many videos that you can click on and watch. These videos are collected in their native languages, Sinhala and Tamil, and then they have subtitles in the other language and in English, so that anybody from various ethnicities can access them. The second modality is through photo essays. So the communities got engaged in collecting, in showing us their objects of memory, which we photographed, and then we used the stories that they attached to them to create photo essays that are also available online. These two methodologies, I would say, are verbal methodologies, but they are the, I would say, the most mediated, because we have hours and hours of footage and so many pictures, and we had to mediate them for an audience. So the original material is all at the archives, but online it is created into a product that somebody else can view and understand within a very short time what the story is. One of the best forms of non-mediated narrative is letter writing. So what we did was we created these opportunities one-on-one. So we were out of these 352, I think we went to about maybe over 200 houses, because in some cases people came together into one house. But we visited people in their own homes many, many times before we collected these narratives. And with the letter writing format, one of the things we gave people who were not able to communicate their life stories was the opportunity to have an addressable other. So when you ask someone their story, they're able to then have someone to tell their story to. Therefore, it is something that is cathartic and they're able to tell. One of the other things about the letter writing format, which is very important, is that especially for women who in some cases are restricted at coming out or speaking out, or are shy to do so, or are controlled by other forces in their area, including culture or the husbands or the men in their life, letter writing offers them the opportunity to go into a room and write this in their own time, in their own house, in their own space, thereby giving them an opportunity that they can't do publicly. One of the other forms is this form called Tree of Life, which is a tool that is used with children mostly, but we use this with adults as well. And this is a depiction, it's a non-verbal kind of form because it's artistic. It's a depiction of one's life in the shape of a tree, where the roots represent your roots, the bark represents your experiences, the branches represent your future hopes and dreams, and the leaves represent people that are important to you, and the ground represents where you are today, what your life is like today. Interviews are another format where we've transcribed the interviews, and they are available in full as well if you go to the National Archives. One of the more interesting forms of methodologies that we use is for intergenerational dialogue, where children and adults, and especially grandparents, can share their stories. So here the children draw their images of their village and what they think they remember, or what they've heard about the village. And then the grandparents fill in the blanks of history and what happened in that place that the kids don't know. In some cases, for example, kids had drawn a place that said empty place because they didn't know why it was empty. And the grandparents filled in the details for them and said, that's where a massacre happened, that's why it's empty, that's why we don't play there. So it's a transfer of intergenerational memories. What I must say in terms of the methodologies that we use here is that having these tools for collecting and creating opportunities for people to tell their stories is a way in which it's a way in which we can collect these stories, but also present them to another audience. So that's where this project goes beyond archiving. So one of the things it does, it moves beyond a product to a process. And this is completely something that a lot of people don't think about in terms of developing memorialization projects. Memorialization is a process. It happens during war, it happens after war, it happens for years and years after. It is not something that there is no end product in a way. So yes, we have created an archive, but we also use that archive as a process to talk about conflict transformation and peace building in the country. To understand, one of the ways in which we do this is we try to sort of use these stories as a way to create empathy and compassion. For example, when you hear somebody saying, this happened to me, and because a lot of people think that their story is quite unique in a way, and that it happened to them and their village, but they don't see that it may have happened to a completely different community on the other side of the country. So seeing similar stories from somebody else speaking in a different language creates that empathy and compassion. And this is a good place to start when we're talking about peace building. It's based on one of the premises that absolute truth does not matter. So in a sense, this is not about finding the truth. This is about finding personal truths. So it creates an opportunity for people to be able to address their own truth. And for us as an audience to understand that there are multiple narratives and many different truths. The other thing that this kind of process does, it doesn't leave memory in the past. It's not something that has happened in the past, but it is about learning lessons from the past for the future, and then moving beyond that towards reconciliation. So one of the ways in which I said we do this is through broadening and widening the dialogue. So we use these stories to create conversations at a village level. So we take some of these stories as a multimedia exhibition. We set it up in villages, sometimes on trees, sometimes in a community hall, but we set it up in villages and we run through a process that is in 3 different stages. As you can see, we work at a community level in homogeneous groups. So if it's a Sinhala group or a Tamil group or Muslim group, we work within their communities in homogeneous groups. This is done intentionally because we want people to be free to be able to tell their stories. And if those stories are hateful stories, that is important too. I think one of the mistakes as peace builders that we make sometimes is bringing people together too soon, where most people don't actually share the pain and the hate they feel for the other person. So what we try to do is to actually work with that hatred, work with that peace, build pain, build empathy and compassion over time before we make them ready enough to meet the other community, because they need to be aware first. Otherwise, it becomes a very superficial engagement. It then moves to an interdivisional level where some of the people who participated at the village level come together and they engage with other communities in the same district, because sometimes you might not know what happened in your neighborhood or to another person. And then it moves to an inter-district level where people from one district go and visit another district. And this is very important because hearing a story is powerful, but seeing the place, seeing some place with bullet holes and hearing or a site of a bomb blast or a site of a massacre and having the people who lived there, who saw this, say what happened to them creates an undeniability of that event. So you know that what you hear is true. It's very difficult to deny when you see something. So the objective of all of this broadening of the dialogue is a people-to-people engagement where you recognize something has happened to the other, where you engage with that person. And by the end of this long-term process, you create a few champions who are able to go back to their village and talk to other people about what happened during the war, but also in some cases have an idea of how to prevent or to understand early warnings and how to sort of talk to people or maybe mediate about not exacerbating conflict potentials. I think I just covered this. So these are some pictures from the exhibition and how the exhibition travels. You see on the bottom left how the photo essays travel. You see on top where the kids are drawing their village stories and so on. And then the communities work together to draw their village maps. So some of the lessons learned from this process is that ignorance of the other is one of those things that have prompted violence. So being able to understand and know how the other feels and know what the other experience for us has shown that it's a starting point to maybe having conversations about non-recurrence of violence. And I'll put a little quote here and maybe you can read it because I think it might take too much time if I read it, from an actual participant who's a young boy who's talking about how knowing he didn't know what had happened before, and maybe this kind of thing is something that could possibly prevent conflict. And one of the things that more than 75% of these participants indicated was that hearing somebody else's experience, especially listening to the voice and the intonation and the pain that an emotional exchange that comes from listening to somebody else, was very powerful. It's not like reading it in a textbook. It's not like reading figures and facts and figures, but it's actually hearing a story. One of the other things that we do with these broadening dialogues or deepening these dialogues at the village level is that we use the stories to create empathy, and then we try to shift the conversation towards values. So we're talking about, we try to connect people to core values that are common to everybody in these different communities and have that as a starting point to having a conversation about non-recurrence of violence. So how can we use these values that we think are quite pertinent to us, and then we recognize that other people have the same values, then how can we use these values to not engage in violent conflict again? So most people, what we realized was most people came up with the same 3 values in all of our groups. I mean, they came up with a lot of others, but these were the 3 main things that cut across. One was tolerance, one was respect, and the other was humanity. Patience or tolerance, I guess. Then, sorry, I'm going back. The other thing we did, as I said, in terms of drawing those maps, is concentrating on intergenerational transfer of memory. And this, a lot of people found useful and important because one of the things that's missing, especially from protracted conflict, is that after the end of the conflict, I think, especially in a context like Sri Lanka, where the media and the government at the time wanted people to sort of draw a line in the sand and move on, not deal with the past, a lot of children may not know what conflict is in reality. They might think about war, especially when we were talking to a lot of youth, they would say things like, well, if another war starts, we can end it again, because they don't actually understand the impact and the actual cost of conflict. So having parents and grandparents relate these conversations to young people was seen as very important by the groups. This is especially true because often you don't actually have these opportunities, especially with youth, with media, with social media and so on. So what we are trying to do is use that opportunity, create opportunities for face-to-face dialogue, but at the same time use that through media as well. Which brings me to the next part of how we engage or how we use this archive. It's about widening public dialogue. So the first one was about deepening, working with the same communities over and over again. And the second one is much more about broadening that dialogue. So what we do is we use social media. We use Facebook to share these stories and generate discussions. We use other media sources, other social media sources, that have wide circulation to write stories and to use our stories or our archive when they write the stories as examples and so on. So we use their base. And we also did a series of radio talk shows and TV shows that brought some of these people onto the stage, but also brought some other respected actors or artists or so on to talk about why memory is important and why we need to learn from our past. And in terms of if this was successful, I think a lot of these stories were looked at, but one of the things we need to push for is long-term media engagement. And in a sense, one of the key lessons we had was that actually for radio and TV, this needs to be a much more sustained long-term process where we have many shows. And it has helped in a context like Sri Lanka, where we didn't have an NGO presence. So we didn't brand our material. It just went as a TV show that they produced. We had this logo that said memorymap.lk, which is the website, but we didn't brand it with any NGO branding. And this we found was quite useful because there's, in Sri Lanka at least at the time, there's an anti-NGO sentiment, so whatever you say does not get taken seriously. But having those people, the people that this happened to speak to each other, was very powerful because it's not coming from an NGO, it's coming from ordinary citizens. The third thing we do is policy engagement. So we share these documents with government, we talk to other civil society initiatives, we share our products, our tools with other organizations that they can do this. And then we also have the traveling exhibition, which I mentioned, that then we have in some cases lent to other people as well so they can use it. So the objective is not really to keep it contained, but to try and get it out as much as possible, with the expectation that having the opportunity to hear another story may open people's minds. One of the other things that was very useful and important in this project is the development evaluation methodology. And this is key because in a project that deals with memorialization and using memory and archives for conversations on non-recurrence of violence and peace building, there needs to be a certain flexibility built into the project, especially in contexts that are difficult, like in Sri Lanka, where there is a shrinking of space for NGOs to engage in peace building work and so on. So what I mean by flexibility is that as the project moves, if we had a certain set of goals at the beginning of what we wanted to achieve, and we went towards that, it wouldn't really have worked because the context is dynamic and constantly changing. So we needed to actually find a way in which we could respond to those changing contexts all the time throughout the project. And one of the things that this meant was that we used the development evaluation methodology as our key evaluation process. So I've just included a quote that my colleague who's working on development evaluation put in her presentation. But this is basically, if I sort of give an overview of what the development evaluation methodology has done for this project, it's actually about being able to learn and include those learnings at every stage of the project. So for example, if we had a community dialogue this week, the partners, us, the facilitators, we'll all sit together and we'll do an after-action review that very day, talk about what worked, what didn't work, and the very next the community memory dialogue that we have in another village will include some of those changes and some of those learnings. So the point of a development evaluation methodology is not to assess and evaluate the project at the end of a cycle, but to feed back into the project some of the learnings and change the project as it goes. So it's not about a final report or something. It's really about the project and improving the project. So, for example, if I show you some of the assumptions and the theory of change we had at the beginning of the project, it looked like this. It was, if you can see it, it's a mess. We had some ideas of what we wanted to do and where we wanted to go. We had some assumptions, but it was not clear how all of these relate to each other. But as we were working and as we were learning in the project actually shifted direction quite a bit. For example, at the beginning, we wanted to create community memorials within these communities, but having done a series of consultations on what memorialization meant to different people, it was kind of obvious that this was not the right time, because memorials could be manipulated by people. In some cases, they were derelict, and once the in-group that did the memorial was not there anymore, they couldn't actually, the stories weren't accessible anymore, and so on. I mean, we can talk about that if you're interested. I can share some lessons from the memorials, or you can actually go to the website where we have the report. But so we dropped that idea, because we were able to drop it because we didn't have a regular log frame that was much more of a development process, a traditional development kind of log frame. But having this process meant that we could actually, by the end of our project, it became something much more clear. Our activities, our assumptions, our outcomes, everything became clearer because we learned as we were doing. So these are some of the key lessons that we learned. I've tried to do this in brief, but if you do have any questions, you can ask me. Jack, hello?
Great. Yes, Radhika, thank you
Yeah.
very much for the detailed.
Just to say, if you go to www.memorymap.lk, you will find all of these like the toolkits, a resource pack that has all the lessons learned with all the substantiated findings, the oral history toolkits, and the facilitation guides that we've used at every stage.
Great. Well, Radhika, thank you very much for a very detailed presentation. You've given us a lot to think about. To our audience, thank you for your patience. We're now going to open up today's presentation to your questions. Just a couple of notes about our format. For those of you who are new to the Thursday Talks, you can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function on GoToWebinar, where you can type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon. That will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace. So those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and learn from our discussion. Now, the questions were flying in during the webinar. The first one comes from, I think, Kelly Abbott. And Kelly's asked, how do you define peace building? What does peace mean? Is it just about violence?
Sorry, just let me, could you repeat that, please?
How do you define peace building? What does peace mean? Is it just about violence? And I think this goes back to, I think, slide 6, Radhika, which refers to like going beyond memory.
Right. For us, we actually, for this particular project, and I'm not talking about definitions of peace or anything, we're not concentrating on peace as the absence of violence, but what we are looking at is non-recurrence of violence. So we're looking very briefly at one achievable goal, hopefully. And just to answer your question, in recent times, we've had a resurgence of violence, particularly targeting the Muslim community. And a lot of us involved in the project are kind of, slightly getting a little bit depressed, thinking, well, what's the use of all this work? But actually, when we spoke to the communities after, the communities that we had been working with were more resilient to outside threats where people were trying to manipulate them into violence. So in a way, the kind of work we've done over time, using memory to talk about non-recurrence of violence within a very local context, was relatively successful, at least in our communities that we had been working with. So for us, I'm not going to talk about a definition of a wider piece. This is mainly, for this project, about non-recurrence.
Great, thank you, Radhika. Our next question is quite long, and there's quite a few parts to the question. It comes from Safia Iban Garba of Generations for Peace. And Safia writes, thank you for sharing this about this very interesting project. Here are a few questions. How long did it take you to collect the materials? Secondly, for women who use the non-verbal methods, for example, letter writing, how did you get access to them and help them get the permission to write their stories that would be shared publicly? And finally, How long did you work with each of the homogenous groupings before moving to the next level of village or district discussions?
Okay, thank you, Sophia, for the question. For the Herstories project, we took a year to collect the stories. That is 285 stories. And for this project, again, I think we took a year and a few months to collect the stories. Because it's not simply about getting people together to write, we actually visit homes in a lot of the cases. And just to give you an example of how the access happened, I'll just say, there are oral history protocols which are identified in the toolkit as well, which are about how you approach people, what kind of, you have to tell them that this is a collaborative exercise, that I'm here to collect your story, but you have the right to say no, whatever. You tell them everything, you tell them where it's going to be, that it's going to be the National Archives and it's going to be online, and they can take that story out at any point if they wish to. There are established oral history protocols that we follow. In terms of accessing community members, it was really interesting that during the Herstories project, which was actually a more restrictive time period in Sri Lanka, we wanted to actually collect 100 women's stories. But when you go into a village and you start talking to women and you explain what you're trying to do, then they say they're quite happy. At that time, nobody had asked their stories because this was not a transitional justice, was not a formal process. So they would start telling your story, and then once they finish and they feel that catharsis that comes from telling the story, they're like, you've got to wait here, I'll go and bring somebody else, and it just snowballed into 285 stories because people just kept bringing other women who wanted to tell their stories. And it was kind of the same process with the community memorialization project as well, where we went into a community. We had these little meetings, pocket meetings, with few people gathered, explaining what the project was about, and why we were collecting these stories, why it's important to archive memory of ordinary people. And people volunteered. Everything is based on volunteerism. So people volunteered to tell their story, and then all of them signed a waiver about using the stories publicly, but within that waiver, they know that they have the opportunity to take it out at any point. So if someone were to write to us and say, take that story out, we had to take it out. There were one or two stories that actually, in some of the other work we did, that we actually had to destroy because they wanted the story gone. So with women particularly, it was it was through other projects that they were engaged in, so producer groups, agriculture groups, and so on. We accessed those groups and we told them about this project and what the project was all about. And they would, they again volunteered, and the letter writing format actually gives them the opportunity not to get permission from their families or whatever, and to be able to share their story, in some cases anonymously. So some people have written their names, some people have not written their names. But the point was that they got to tell their story. But we got their permission to publicize their stories. In terms of how long we worked with the groupings, again, the process was long. So before we did any dialogue, community level dialogue, we actually did pocket meetings and a town hall type of meeting where we explain we showcase some of the stories from the archive as a mini exhibition. We then said, look, we want to talk about these stories, we want to talk about these things that happen to other people, and then we went into the communities through community leaders. So what we did was we presented these to community leaders and explained it to them, and then worked with the elders in the community to organize these groups. So most of them were either done together with individual community leaders or with small community-based organizations that worked with us then to invite people and have these sessions. So the whole process of the 3 different stages and the build-up work and the sort of the pocket meetings that happen in between was about a year long. Thanks, Jack.
Great, thank you, Radhika. So I want to dig in, use my moderator's privilege here, and dig into a couple of things that you just mentioned and mentioned throughout the presentation. Obviously, I think nearly everybody on this webinar appreciates the importance of stories, that people-to-people engagement is key to develop empathy and contextualize an event rather than view it as an isolated incident, which happens kind of in the abstract. But a lot of these stories come based on memory, and memory itself can often be clouded by different influences. So I'm wondering, how did you verify and validate many of these stories?
As I said earlier, this particular project is based on the idea that memory is fluid and that memory is something that is precious to the person who's telling the story. So because that person, their memory was an absolute truth, we didn't go to edit it, we didn't verify it, and the project itself is based on the idea that absolute truth doesn't matter in a context like Sri Lanka so much as the ability to tell, because they were prevented from grief, they were prevented from sharing stories, they were prevented from speaking for a long time. So at that time we were collecting these stories, it was simply about giving the opportunity to share whatever story they wanted. But one of the things that works is that when we are talking to an entire community or an entire region, most of these people over time, when you look at it as a collection of stories, they corroborate each other, and their point of views may be different, but you can, if you read every story from a certain village, you will get a picture of what the true nature of that event or incident was. So we didn't verify every single story, and we didn't change anything of what they said. So that's one of the oral history protocols, that you don't interfere with that story. And if it's a clouded memory, that's fine, because over time, like when you look at the whole thing and you look at other stories, they corroborate each other, or you can, if you're doing it for research purposes, then you can actually eliminate certain things. But the point of this is to provide a platform for people to share many different viewpoints. So it's with the understanding that there are multiple narratives of the truth.
Great, thank you, Radhika. I think that's really interesting, and it's a great way of framing this. You know, conflict is very personal, and the way people remember incidents and internalize incidents can be quite different. So not sort of doubling down on every single granular detail, I think is very important to allow people to be open with you. Our next question comes from Raj Molmi, and Raj is my colleague at Search for Common Ground and our regional director for the Asia region. And Raj writes, can you tell us a bit about how the government participated or reacted to this initiative? What was their role, or what are the ingredients of success for a project such as this?
Let me sort of frame that in the context of the two different projects that happened. The precursor to the conflict, the community memorialization project, Herstories, and the community memorialization project. So in 2012, when we did the Herstories project, that was together with the organization called Billion View that I did it. When we did that project, there was, as I said, a very restrictive space for NGOs or anybody to speak. Actually, you couldn't, like, grief was silent, so you couldn't actually mourn. If you were in the north, you couldn't actually mourn your dead. Martyr graveyard, or the graveyard, some of the graveyards were razed to the ground, so there was no memory of that person, whoever was buried there, having lived or died, because actually a lot of IDs and so on would have been lost as well, because, you know, of the conflict, and people moved from place to place. So in a sense, the only memory of some of those people that existed was in the memory of the people that lived, who then told their story, and that record is on that space. So the time was quite restrictive. And in that space, no one was allowed to speak about this. So that project in 2012 was a clandestine project. We didn't get permission to do it. We did it, well, actually quite dangerously, sort of going from village to village, talking to people. And we did have certain problems of being stopped and so on. And actually, the times are so bad that we actually destroyed every single name and address of person we took the story, so we can't actually trace them back now. But for their safety, we destroyed all the names because yeah, I won't go into details of why we had to do that. But there was some intimidation and so on. But by the time 2015 came around, the atmosphere had changed, and transitional justice was a formal mechanism that government had accepted. So there was much more support for memorialization work. In fact, the government created ONUR, which is Office for National Unity and Reconciliation, and the SCRM, which is Secretariat for Coordinating the Reconciliation Mechanisms, I think. And they both have been very supportive of this kind of memorialization work, and have given us a lot of prominence, given us support to find people, and been quite open with us. So times change and situations change. But for example, when we had a crisis last year for 56 days, when there was a change, there was a sort of a coup d'etat, we actually went offline. The website, we took the websites offline for the safety of those people who had shared their stories. So I think this is the other thing I was talking about, being responsive to a dynamic context. It's not always easy working in this kind of context, but we've got to assess the situation and sort of work with it, because the primary concern for this is the people whose stories have been shared.
Great, thank you, Radhika. I want to touch on one last thing before we wrap up today, and that is your use of developmental evaluation. We are an evaluation webinar, and Michael Quinn Patton is a friend of the Thursday Talks. He has done many of them in the past. So I just want to sort of touch on this a little bit. How did having an evaluator embedded in the project help you better achieve your project's goals, as opposed to having the traditional sort of monitoring plans and then post-project evaluation?
It was interesting because I personally had not worked on DE in one of my projects at all, and previous to this, so it was something completely new. And as a concept leader for this particular project, and while developing it, I was quite skeptical as to whether this was something that, not quite skeptical, but I was a little nervous as to how it would work. The thing was, the project was designed for learning and sort of changing and being fluid. I just didn't know how to do it. So having DE, a person who was an expert in DE embedded within the project, was actually really useful, and became something that was much more of a sort of a team member who would then help us unpack all of the stuff that was coming out and help us learn from it. Because, as I said, the intention to be responsive to the ground was always there. We just didn't have the skills as a project team. So having that person in, I think, in a way, I think some people might think, okay, that's too close to the subject, or it's not evaluation enough. But actually, I think if the point for me of DE was about making the project better, it was perfect. It really sort of helped us unpack and think about how what we were learning could be recalibrated and shape the project as it went along. And it made the project so much better, I think, over time, because where we started and where we ended were two different places. I'm talking about the first phase, and the second phase is going on, and we're still changing. So it's a really great tool, especially for something like memorialization and peace building work, because I think, I've been involved in peace building for about 15, or conflict transformation work for about 15 years, and having a sort of a traditional log frame thing, especially because, this peace building is a long-term process, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So having that kind of accessibility to information that you feed directly into the project as you're going, it changed my understanding of how this work can be done. So I thought it was very successfully embedded.
Great, thank you, Radhika. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that, one of the biggest challenges peace building projects face is obviously the short-term funding cycles. And as a result, priorities are set 21 months in advance. So the emergence of adaptive management, of developmental evaluation, of emergent design practices, I think are hugely important for a field, particularly because we work in contexts which are incredibly fluid and dynamic. So it's a welcome change, and I'm really glad that you had a very positive experience of the developmental evaluation. And thank you, Radhika, for a great presentation and great Q&A. Thank you to our audience for joining another edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. Just a reminder, this recording will be posted on our media gallery later today. We will accompany that with the links to all the websites that Radhika has mentioned. So please feel free to return to it and share it with your colleagues and continue the discussion in the comment section. We're going to be back next week. That is 10 a.m. on the 23rd of August with Alistair Stewart of BBC Media Action, who's going to lead a discussion on conducting research in conflict settings, lessons from Iraq, Libya, and South Sudan. I know many of you have already registered for that webinar, but there'll be more details in your inbox tomorrow. Once again, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Radhika, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you.